Well, if this were Palm Sunday, which it is, we should be praising Hosanna in the highest, welcoming Jesus into Jerusalem on his way to the cross and waving palm fronds, which we aren't. Because in our church, we take the Christian story seriously, but not literally. So at the end of a Lenten series focused on progressive values, I chose to include a biblical story, a biblical reading of Holy Week, which is a story that is nearest the Last Supper. A woman comes in, and I like to think of it as she breaks a jar on Jesus' head. Perfumed oil all over him. Of course, it's a portent to his death and the herbs they will use on the body, but it's a special moment in this story. Again, probably this thing never actually happened, which makes it in some ways even more special because the writers are trying to tell us something, and they're asking us to interpret what is happening. Of course, the disciples start to complain on economic terms. We could have sold that and fed the poor, they say. And Jesus does two things. He says, hey, dummies, I'm going to die soon, so pay attention. And then he does something quickly and quietly. He says, of this unnamed woman, let her be. These words are a variant of them. Don't trouble the woman, he says. Should be emblazoned on buildings and t-shirts, a reminder to the religious who use their faith as a weapon against women. Let her be. Do not trouble this woman. So we enter the last sermon of a Lenten series with this unnamed woman. She is not a mother. She is not a servant. She is not a prostitute. She is not someone who's going to get a lesson from Jesus, as so many of the women in the Christian scriptures are. She is just a woman. She is any woman. Don't trouble her. Wiser words have never been said. And lead us to the sermon today. Women's rights are human rights. You see, I spend most of my time when I'm not home with women. There are 3 guys in my house and 1 woman. She's mighty but extremely short. We love her. But at the abortion clinic where I volunteer as a chaplain, everyone is a woman, staff and patients. The only men are boyfriends and husbands in the waiting room. At Planned Parenthood board meetings where I spend some time, most of the staff and board members are women. At church, most of our staff, most of the membership, and most of you who attend church are women. And that's a great thing, because women are great. They talk, they share, they express in ways that men just aren't good at. Let's face it. I go out with my guy friends and I come home and my wife asks me, how is so-and-so? And I say, I don't know. It's not me, I promise. We just don't tell each other our struggles. We often hide them in shelters of masculinity. I know that's not always the case. But I go to the clinic and I ask, how are things? And I end up sitting down and hearing stories that come from the heart about how women are working their way or struggling through their lives in the world, the choices they have to make, the predicaments they are in. And I feel filled with gratitude. And I feel tense at the same time, knowing that we still have so many problems for women in our society. The list of problems starts with the fact that we have never had an equal rights amendment, despite the fact that it was presented almost 100 years ago in our country. The problems look like the prevalence of abuse that women endure, the kinds that we have heard through the Me Too movement. The problems look like sexism that leads to low self-esteem in our young girls, that leads to drastic events in their lives. The problems look like the fact that in the movies, a male orgasm gets a PG-13 rating, and a female orgasm gets an R rating. Did you know that? They look like legislative attempts to regulate women's bodies that happen 700 times more than attempts to regulate men's bodies. Why? Because there are no attempts to regulate men's bodies. The problems look like a federal House and Senate that are 80% male and 20% female, both nationally and in our state. They look like the fact that only 6.4% of CEOs of the Fortune 500 companies are women. They look like the fact that on average, by the time a professional woman is 60 in America, she will make $450,000 less than a man in the same position. If you look at that spread, that's almost $1 million difference. That's a lot. The list goes on. The work has been long and slow to change. The history of women's rights is long and storied, and some of it not so great. We often look back to the suffragists, the women who tried to get women's vote in America. We celebrate them for their 1848 First Women's Rights Conference. 170 years ago, they wrote and signed a Declaration of Sentiments, they called it, which is basically a rewrite of the Declaration of Independence. Women and men signed the document. It said, in short, we are all equal. And then a few lines I want to quote to you. It said, God has created a false public sentiment by giving to the world a different code of morals for men and women, by which moral delinquencies, which exclude women from society and are not only tolerated, but deemed of little account in men. He has endeavored in every way that he could destroy her confidence in her own powers, to lessen her self-respect, and to make her willing to lead a dependent and abject life. Now, in view of this entire disenfranchisement of one half of the people in this country, their social and religious degradation, in view of the unjust laws above mentioned, and because women do feel themselves aggrieved, oppressed, and fraudulently deprived of their most sacred rights, we insist that they have immediate admission to all rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of the United States. 1848. The suffragists worked to get women's right to vote, and in the 19th Amendment finally got it. Only one person who signed that document saw that amendment go into law. Many of the suffragists were Unitarians and Universalists, for which we are proud. Now, I was at the AFIA Center a few weeks ago. It's a center for support of Black women's reproductive justice in South Dallas and in Texas, and I was getting a tour from my new friend, Reverend Deneen Robinson. She was showing me pictures of their actions, the things that they have done and stood up for in terms of women of color and reproductive justice. There was a picture of them in front of the State House in Austin wearing black and white dresses. And she said the suffragists, they wore white as a protest. And so she said, we wore black and white as Black women. And I said proudly, many of the suffragists were Unitarian and Universalists. And she nodded. She said, yeah, I know. And they were racists. I was reminded not to be so smug about my faith heritage, and how the intersection between race and women's rights is intertwined from the beginning. I was reminded that the suffragists turned on Black women. At the time, Black men were allowed to vote, and it was a point of contention in the racist Southern states, as you imagine. So the suffragists appealed to white Southern women by telling them that if they had the vote, they could counter the Black male voice. American suffragette Carrie Chapman Catt, founder of the League of Women Voters, is known to have said, white supremacy will be strengthened, not weakened, by women's suffrage. And facing that history is important, and it gets worse. In reproductive rights, we often try to look at the intersectional histories with regards to race. At a recent board meeting of this church, it was opened by a story that a board member told to encourage us to think more deeply about racial inequity. He told the story of James Marion Sims, who developed pioneering tools and surgical techniques related to women's reproductive health. He's credited as the father of modern gynecology. The 19th century physician has been lionized with statues in New York City and South Carolina and Pennsylvania. Sims invented the vaginal speculum, a tool for dilation and examination. He also pioneered a technique to repair vesico-vaginal fistulas, common in the 19th century as complications to childbirth. But Sims was doing his research on enslaved black women, and wait for it, without anesthesia. Sims held the racist notion that black people didn't feel pain like white people did. And like most doctors of the 19th century, Sims originally had no interest in working on female patients. And with no gynecological training, his interest in this only occurred when a woman came into his clinic because she fell off a horse. He began examining in 1845 a surgical technique to treat fistulas. So he made a deal with slave owners that if they paid the taxes and clothed the women patients, he would take ownership of them and their treatment. Today we know the names of 3 women who were the subjects of his experimentation on female fistula: Lucy, Anarcha, and Betsy. Let us hold those names just a moment. Lucy was 18 years old and had given birth and hadn't been able to control her bladder. So during a procedure where patients were put on a table and asked to perch on their knees and bend forward on their elbows and their heads, Lucy endured an hour-long surgery, screaming and crying in pain as a dozen doctors watched. Sims later wrote that Lucy became extremely ill, and he said, "I thought she was going to die." It took her 2 to 3 months to recover entirely from the effects of the operation. For a long time, Sims's fistula surgeries were not successful. But after 30 operations on 17-year-old slave named Anarcha, he finally perfected the method. In the 1850s, Sims moved to New York and opened the first ever women's hospital where he continued to test his controversial treatments. A statue was put opposite the Academy of Medicine in Central Park in New York City, as well as in South Carolina, outside his old medical school for him. Now here's the good news. In January, the Mayor's Advisory Council in New York City announced their decision to remove and relocate James Marion Sims' statue with its current plaque to be replaced, bearing the names Lucy, Anarcha, and Betsy, with their histories involved. You see, we can't turn away from these painful intersections between race when we start to talk about women's rights. And it's not over. These attacks on women continue, especially in the reproductive rights realm. The battle goes on even today. Our government this week will close a period of comments on what they're calling religious refusals that could end up legalizing discrimination against women and LGBT folks by their doctors and pharmacists and healthcare workers, from lab technicians to volunteers, who will have an unprecedented discretion to deny patients care for any moral, ethical, or religious reasoning they can come up with. That means that in an emergency situation, a healthcare worker, because of their transphobia or racism or anti-abortion ideology, could be part of a life and death consequence for patients in their care. There are online petitions if you want to get involved in religious refusals, and you have till Tuesday. Religious leaders who support this kind of discrimination in the name of religious freedom are just wrong. I sat with a woman 2 weeks ago who was required by her doctor to have an abortion due to an anomaly that would kill the child and maybe damage the woman. When she went to her priest, he told her that if she had an abortion, that she was a sinner. What I know is that in these cases, and in less complicated ones, and at the State House and in the federal buildings, and our elected officials are looking at complicated situations. They're making decisions based on ideology. And we have a role in addressing that. Not only by lifting up these histories and these moments in the world, but also doing it with power and compassion. As a person of faith, I think our aim is to further the emancipation of the human spirit, to create an inclusive and tolerant world for all, not just for some. Our progressive charge is to make attempts to find ways to live together, not make sure that some have access to things like health care, but that we all have access to things like health care. I think our role is to try to reclaim a progressive voice that puts women's agency in the center, to understand the intersections between race and justice around issues of poverty and immigration, and to find common ground that is spiritual. As the faithful, we need to be concerned with the most vulnerable, not how to get rich or receive God's blessings, as some churches are probably talking about today, but to find ways to advocate for the least of these, people with real biographies who have to make difficult decisions, sometimes choosing to end life so theirs can continue, or to choose between caring for their bodies and feeding their children. And this is a painful reality we are in, but if we don't stand up, who will? We need to be concerned with drawing people to humanity's highest values and challenging the bisecting of our lives and our families and our communities by ideology and prejudice. We need to see that all people have dignity and worth, not just people who identify as men. This fall, I met Rabbi Joshua Heschel's daughter. Heschel was the rabbi, really, of the civil rights movement. His daughter, Susanna, is an activist in human rights and women's rights and LGBT rights, and she quoted her father a lot in this meeting. And she said, today is like a new civil rights era for women and people of color and LGBT folks. She said something I will never forget. She said, we need today as a guide some moral grandeur and spiritual audacity. I love those words. That audacity and grandeur doesn't sit back and let discrimination get codified in law. It also doesn't try or promote the fact that some are right and some are wrong, that our enemies, the people we disagree with, are somehow bad people. It tries to undo those binary thoughts, just like it tries to undo the notion that men and women are different or have a different rights in the world. It stands up when others sit down. It holds human beings as sacred. Rabbi Heschel said, every human being is a kind of reminder of God, and all things are like traces of God's footprints in a barren desert. Through all the things in the world, it is possible to come close to the source. It is incumbent upon us to imitate the footprints and remove the veil of God who is masked in the costume of the world. In the rabbi's attempt to speak what it means to be a human being, he asked us to transgress against binary thinking. He ferociously worked against oppression and injustice, saying that God has a soul and responds to what we do, and faith has a role in keeping us focused on the bigger issues of justice without dividing our communities or bisecting us from our friends and our neighbors. He reminded us that our perceived enemies are our neighbors and our friends too, our co-workers, the people we are related to, and that to demonize them was to fall prey to the same kind of ignorance, bigotry, and hatred that brought us to that conversation. I think he is right. I also think we need to work ceaselessly on all fronts and to take our own advice to work for the dignity of others and ourselves and to give dignity to everyone we meet, to challenge ourselves to birth equity in our midst and nurture a spirit that doesn't divide us. Love is love. Black lives do matter. No human is illegal. Science is real. Compassion is the way forward, and women's rights are human rights. These are the values we've been preaching for the last 6 weeks. They call us to lift up dignity in our communities and in our lives. They call us to create health where health can be given to each other, and they call us to wholeness. They say that a sure and certain hope for us as a species rests in our ability to live into these values which we have highlighted. Our survival rests in the need to work with love in our hearts and to care not to divide ourselves from our enemies, and especially not from our allies like the suffragists did, whether they did it on purpose or not. Our survival rests in the need to rely on God's greatness and our ability to see each other with love in our hearts. And it means that we need vision. We need to be able to see the future we want to build, a future where, with regards to women's rights, men turn over power to others and hear the vision from women and typically marginalized groups. And that's why I'm going to step back in a moment, and I want to invite these women to come forward, because the final word of this sermon are women's voices envisioned through women leaders, given to you through women's bodies and voices. These members of our church will speak to you now.
These are the words of Gloria Felt, the founder and president of Take the Lead. The next generation can be the one that takes leadership parity to the finish line. I hope they know their choices are not just about them, that what each of us does enhances or limits opportunities for the next woman. I hope they know they have so much power in their hands to lead their own dreams forward, but that power unused is power useless. I hope they use power tool number 1. Know your history, and you can create the future of your choice.
Words of Shannon Turner, founder of Hear Me Code, an organization offering all-female coding classes. I hope that the next generation of women leaders continue to extend the ladder once they've climbed up. I hope that change continues, because as far as we've come, we still have so far to go, especially when it comes to equal pay and equal treatment in the workplace.
These words are by Malika Sadazar, the director of Human Rights Project for Girls. I hope for women and girls of the next generation that we have a world in which our lives are not disposable, that we are not by virtue of being a woman or girl denigrated, abused, assaulted, or rendered property. I hope for and work towards a world for the next generation in which every girl and woman is valued and can live out her full potential free of violence.
These are the words of Tracy Sturdivant, co-founder of Make It Work campaign. My hope is that the next generation doesn't have to limit their dreams of who they want to be in the world because we don't have systems in place that allow them to be their best selves. Whether that's being valued in the workplace or valued at home, women are the backbones of families, and we need support in place that allow them to show up in the workplace and pursue success. My hope is that the next generation won't have to make some of the difficult choices between showing up for work and showing up for a loved one that needs help. It is our job to show the next generation that we value women.
It is. May it be so, and amen. Thank you. Let us sing together now hymn number 322, verses 1, 4, and 5. 322.